Welcome to another episode of Geospinach. Today we are venturing into the complex world of zones of influence. While there isn't a universally accepted academic definition, there is a broad consensus that zones of influence are a tangible reality, particularly within the realism school of thought. To make this concept more accessible, we are going to dissect it into four distinct categories, providing practical examples for each and exploring instances of conflict and overlap. It's crucial to note that zones of influence and zones of interest, while they may overlap, are fundamentally different. Zones of interest are areas a nation might desire to influence but may lack the capacity to do so. So, let's dive into the four zones of influence: the primary, the secondary, the tertiary, and finally the minor zone of influence. Before we delve into the specific zones of each influence, it's essential to grasp the underlying concept of a zone of influence. What we mean by this, it's an area where a nation has a strong or weak interest, which in turn shapes its geopolitical policy towards that region, nation, or territory. For instance, for all nations, their primary zone of influence is their own territory. This becomes evident when a nation plunges into social strife leading to civil war. Both sides, viewing the entire nation as their primary zone of influence, will immediately go to war to protect their interests. A prime example is the United States Civil War, where the Federal Republic saw the entire nation as its primary zone of influence, while the Confederate States consider only themselves as such. The war was essentially a struggle for the federal government to reassert its authority over the nation, while the Confederate States sought to protect their individual states. In contrast, during the Russian Civil War of 1917, all belligerents, except the individual nation states, viewed the entire Russian Empire as their primary zone of influence, indicating they wouldn't cease fire until they had captured all of their former Russian Empire territory. Understanding zones of influence is crucial because overlapping zones naturally lead to conflict. To fully comprehend zones of influence, one must first understand the concepts of alliances, neutrals, and enemies. Allied nations have no issue with overlapping zones of influence, while neutral or enemy nations will inevitably experience friction due to conflicting zones of influence. Moreover, zones of influence aren't confined to nations as countries. They also extend to territories such as air and sea. By now, you've probably grasped that the stronger a nation is, in geopolitical, economic, military terms, the larger its zone of influence is. Hence, it's vital to understand the strength level of each nation and how alliance system works to comprehend how conflict arises. Military and economic alliances inherently amplify pre-existing zones of influence. Take for example the United States, which has very strong primary and minor zones of influence. However, the NATO alliance, of which the United States is a part and a leader, has a much larger primary and secondary zone of influence. The same applies to the European Union. For instance, Hungary or Poland wouldn't concern themselves with a nation like Turkey because it's outside their zones of influence. But Turkey falls within the secondary zone of influence of the European Union as a whole. Thus, Poland and Hungary have a say to policies directed towards Turkey through the EU, so their zones of influence are amplified. Whether the EU as an organization can exert strong influence on that zone is a matter for another time. Let's now delve into the classification of each type of zone of influence, starting with the primary zone. The primary zone of influence encompasses the immediate geographic region around a country where its influence is most potent. This includes the nation state itself and the primary links that keep the country functioning. These are vital for the nation's existence and align with the concept of natural allies discussed in our previous video on alliances. However, a nation might rely on another for its existence but lack the military or economic strength to exert its influence in that zone. Therefore, we wouldn't consider that zone as primary due to that nation's inability to enforce its influence. It's crucial to understand that zones of influence are dynamic, shifting with the world stage, economic fluctuations, and changes in military strength. For instance, the United States' primary zones of influence includes itself, Canada, Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, a significant part of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans extending as far as Hawaii. Similarly, Britain's primary zone of influence in the 1920s encompassed its entire empire, as specifically the British Channel in Europe. This meant that if a neutral nation like France will have built a navy to challenge the British Channel, Britain would likely have gone to war or used hard politics to prevent this due to the threat to its primary zone of influence. However, with Britain's current weakened state and its stronger alliance with France, a larger French navy wouldn't pose a direct threat to British control of the British Channel, leading to a reduction in Britain's primary zone of influence. Furthermore, a controversial but realistic example is Israel, where Palestine, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights are seen as primary zones of influence because Israel believes its survivability depends on them. This is why Israel was willing to go to war in 1967 to gain control of these territories. The secondary zone of influence is similar to the primary zone, but it covers strategic, economic, cultural, ideological interest, and general geography. This includes crucial trade routes and important allied nations. For instance, with the Monroe Doctrine in the late 19th century, the United States declared Latin America as part of its secondary zone of influence or even primary. I will argue this was the case due to the weakness of Latin American nations rather than the strength of the US at the time. Today, Latin American nations are likely part of the US secondary or even tertiary zone of influence. As for the tertiary zone of influence, not all nations necessarily have one. For some countries, the tertiary and minor zones of influence are practically the same, primarily because they're so small in size. For example, Cyprus, a microstate, only has a primary zone of influence, which is its own territory. Due to its lack of military and economic ability to exert force outside its land, this implies that it's not even able to have direct control over its sea or air, and its sea or air can ironically be considered its secondary zone of influence. A tertiary zone of influence is a zone where a country has a primarily strong economic interest and some smaller geopolitical interests. Losing influence in a tertiary zone might result in economic disadvantage for a nation, but it will not lead to its destruction. An example of this is the United States and Iraq or Saudi Arabia, where they are part of its tertiary zone of influence, implying that the US has a lot to gain from that region, but it won't collapse because of it. The same applies for Russia with Syria. Lastly, we have minor zones of influence, implying that the nation has a general interest in that country, culturally, ideologically, as well as economically, but to a lesser degree. Due to the strength of the United States, the majority of the world is part of the minor zone of influence of the United States. This is primarily the case only for superstates, which in our era will mean the United States and China. That is why we see the United States and China partially intervening in the politics and economics of sub-Saharan African countries. Now, let's delve into the fascinating part, examples of zones of influence. As you can see, the primary zone of influence for the United States, marked in blue, encapsulates the area where the United States has the political, economic, militaristic, and geographic means to exert complete influence and defense. This includes the United States itself, Canada, Mexico, a significant part of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, extending as far as Hawaii. The secondary zone of influence, marked in red, includes regions covered by the Monroe Doctrine, NATO nations, other Anglo-Saxon nations, as well as Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. The United States might be willing to go to war in this region if it aligns with its interests, unlike the primary zone where it will go to war for any reason without primary considerations. A great example of this was the willingness of the US to go to nuclear war over Cuba. The green zone represents the Tertiary Zone, where the United States has a geographic, political, ideological interest and is willing, in some cases, to exert force or hard politics to enforce its opinions. It's debatable whether India falls within this zone, primarily due to India's general strength, but I have included it anyway because if India chooses not to be neutral, then the United States will most probably respond quite dramatically. Lastly, the minor zone of influence, marked in purple, is where the United States will not go to war for, but will use its soft power to influence those areas for its benefit. This is the case primarily for the superstates, which in our era means the United States and China. Next, let's zoom in into the Eastern Mediterranean to see how zones of influence work with smaller nations and what happens when they overlap. Greece's primary zone of influence includes Greece itself and the Greek Cypriot population of Cyprus. Its secondary zone includes the territorial waters connecting those two lands and the potential resources of those lands, or seas. Turkey's primary zone includes Turkey itself, the Kurdish region of Iran, Iraq, Syria, as well as the Turkish Cypriots, mainly because any strife in those areas immediately affects Turkey geopolitically. Its secondary zone includes all of the Eastern Mediterranean and Azerbaijan, mainly because of their very close cultural, ideological, and geopolitical connections. Lastly, Turkey's tertiary zone includes the general centralized Middle East. The red highlights where the zones of influence of Greece and Turkey interact, leading into conflict, which is the main reason these two countries are natural enemies. This, though, does not imply that zones of influence are written in stone. As a nation economically, militaristically, and politically gets weaker or stronger, its zone of influence expands as well as decreases accordingly. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. If you are interested in diving deeper into nations and their zones of influence, as well as their zones of interest, please comment below. In regards to current events, we've launched a new series with various individuals discussing current political as well as geo-economical issues of importance. Thanks again for all of your support. Good night.